Welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today on Comparative Politics, we are going to be exploring the two major approaches of comparative politics. And in fact, these major approaches are not just restricted to comparative politics, but can be applied to understanding politics in general. And these are the traditional approach and the modern approach. We are going to be looking at the meaning of these two approaches, as well as explore the sub-approaches under these two, and then move further to talk about their characteristics and their limitations, and also the differences between these two. So stick to the very end of this video to learn about this. Let's get started. The first approach is the traditional approach. The traditional approach is actually the first and the oldest approach in the study of comparative politics and politics in general. The origin of this traditional approach can be traced to the ancient times when you have scholars like Plato, Aristotle, and then moving further, you have other contributions from scholars like Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Niccolo Machiavelli, and the likes of them. Now, the major thing about this approach was that it emphasized more on understanding the history, the culture, the value, morality, the ethics, the institutions, and the legal frameworks that actually shape political system. This is as the major emphasis was on historical development, philosophical ideas such as the concept of justice, equality, fairness, and you talk about formal institutions, that is the institutions that makes up the state, and then you talk about legal frameworks such as the laws and the constitution that makes up the political systems. Don't worry, for a better understanding of this, you're going to be looking shortly at the sub-approaches under this traditional approach, as this will help us to understand the traditional approach better. So starting with the first, which is the historical approach. The historical approach is a form of traditional approach which lays emphasis on studying past events, past political phenomena, and also the evolution of political systems. Let's take, for example, if we want to study about democracy, we might decide to look at the historical development of democracy from ancient Greece, where it is believed that it started from. The next, we have the philosophical approach. The philosophical approach is a form of traditional approach which focus more on understanding how best the state can be organized, such as looking into the concept of justice, equality, fairness, morality, and ethics. The major emphasis of this philosophical approach is to create an ideal form of government. A very good example was in Plato's book, The Republic, where he got to explain how best the state can be organized. We move over to the next, which is the institutional approach. The institutional approach is a form of traditional approach which focuses more on understanding the formal institutions of the government. When I talk about formal institutions, I mean like the parliament, the courts, and other forms of institutions that make up the state. The major emphasis of this form of traditional approach is looking into the workings of these institutions. Let's take, for example, if we are comparing the United States Congress and the United Kingdom's Parliament. So this is an example of the comparison of formal institutions between these two countries. And the next, we have legal approach. The legal approach is actually a form of traditional approach which focuses more on understanding the laws and the constitutions that shape the political system. Let's take, for example, if we are to compare the Constitution of United States of America and that of Nigeria, by looking at how these two constitutions actually shapes the political systems in these two countries. That is an example of the legal approach in the study of comparative politics. We move over to the next, which is the characteristics of traditional approach. The traditional approach focuses on history and philosophy. This is because the traditional approach emphasizes more on understanding the past and philosophical ideas about politics. The next is that it focuses on formal institutions. Just as already explained, the traditional approach focuses on formal institutions like the parliament, the courts, and the constitution, rather than focusing on people's behavior. It is descriptive and normative. This is as the traditional approach focuses more on describing political system and also suggesting how things should be, rather than looking at things the way they are. It is qualitative and non-scientific. This is because the traditional approach relies more on reasoning and observation, rather than using scientific methods. It is subjective and value-based. This is because the traditional approach focuses more on personal and societal values and opinion about what is right or wrong. The next, we have the modern approach. Around the 20th century, the world was changing really fast. This was that during this period, the world was becoming more interconnected, We had the two world wars, that is the First and the Second World War. There was rise in technology, rise in globalization, and also the emergence of new ideologies. All of these were the factors that actually gave rise to the modern approach. This was because the traditional approach couldn't fully explain these real-world experiences as at that time. And most of all, the behavioral revolution of the 1950s, which emphasized more on understanding human behavior within the political system rather than focusing on institution. Remember, when we explained the traditional approach, we mentioned that traditional approach focused on understanding institutions. But then the behavioral revolution of the 1950s shifted the focus from understanding these institutions to understanding the human components that makes up this institution, that is the behavior of humans within this institution, and also applying scientific method to understanding this behavior of humans within this institution. All of this gave rise to the modern approach, which provided a practical understanding of these real-world experiences. So rather than theorizing or trying to understand philosophically how the world operates, such as it was in the traditional approach, emphasis was now shifted to understanding these real-world outcome and experiences through the use of data, and also emphasizing more on understanding the behaviors of people within the political system. We'll look at the sub-approaches under this modern approach for us to be able to understand better what this modern approach is all about, starting with the first, the behavioral approach. The behavioral approach is a form of modern approach which focuses on understanding the behaviors of individuals and groups in the political system. Let's take, for example, when we are trying to study why is it that younger people in Nigeria are less likely to vote when compared to older generation. So it is this behavioral approach, which is a form of modern approach that allows us to look at the voting patterns of people in the political system. The next, we have the system approach. The system approach, which is a form of modern approach, sees politics as a form of system. As a system, you have the input, which is made up of the demand and the support, which goes into the political system, and then you have the outputs, which are policies or decisions being made by the political system. Let's take, for example, when the citizens of a nation protest for a new minimum wage, that is a form of demand which goes into the political system. Now, the political system, after much deliberations and meetings, this political system then makes decisions or policy regarding that minimum wage, which are a form of output. The next, we have the structural functional approach. This form of modern approach actually focuses on understanding the different parts of the government, how they work together to maintain stability, such as looking at how the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive, how they come together to play their various roles to achieve the stability of the political system. This is actually different from the institutional approach, which tends to see these different parts as existing in isolation. But rather, this structural functional approach focuses more on the working together of these different institutions in order to establish stability of the system. The next, we have the ecological approach. This ecological approach, which is a form of modern approach, focuses on how physical, social, cultural, technological, and other forms of environment shapes the political system. Let's take, for example, trying to understand how the different cultures within Nigeria shapes the political decisions being made by the government. The next is on the characteristics of this modern approach. The first is that it focuses on human behavior. Unlike the traditional approach, which focused on the institutions of the government, the modern approach actually studies how people behave in politics, such as their voting patterns or their voting behavior. The next is that it is empirical and scientific. Unlike the traditional approach, which relies on philosophical reasoning, the modern approach actually uses data, surveys, and experiments to conduct and study politics. The next is that it is interdisciplinary in nature. Unlike the traditional approach, which focuses on just political institutions, the modern approach actually brings insight from sociology, economics, psychology, and other disciplines. The next is it is objective and analytical. Unlike the traditional approach, which is subjective and influenced by values, the modern approach actually avoids bias and relies more on measurable facts. It is data-driven and practical. Unlike the traditional approach, which is descriptive, the modern approach emphasizes real-world applications and solutions based on evidences. This brings us to the end of this video on the approaches of comparative politics. Both the traditional and the modern approaches are valuable in understanding politics. The traditional approach helps us to understand the history, the ideals, and the structures that shape political system, while on the other hand, the modern approach provides insight to understand real-world behaviors, trends, data, making politics more practical and measurable. Using both approaches enriches our understanding of politics in a comprehensive way. If you have any questions, you can drop that in the comment section. Don't forget to like, don't forget to share, don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next video. Thanks.